I'm Jana Wong Healy, and I've been a film industry professional for years, having worked in development, production, and distribution for a variety of film studios and companies. I currently teach business communication at the University of Southern California's Marshall School of Business. I'm here with Stephen Gundel, a professor of film and television studios at the University of Warwick in the UK, a film historian and an expert on Italian cinema. Today, we're excited to be discussing Dino's Italian films. So, Stephen, what was the situation like in Italy for film producers, after World War II ended?
Well, I think most people probably know something of the neorealist films that were made in Italy in the immediate aftermath of the war. There was Rome Open City by Rossellini, which came out in towards the end of 1945, which he followed with Paesà the following year, Bicycle Thieves by De Sica a couple of years later. These were all films which either recounted in a crudely realistic way the experiences that ordinary Italian citizens had had during the war. That's to say, it presented them not as aggressors, not as partners of Hitler's Germany, but as ordinary people who had suffered under the oppression of dictatorship and foreign invasion. Or they were films that focused on the problems of the immediate post-war years, problems of homelessness, unemployment, shortages of food, and so on. Now, these films have a sort of legendary status in a way. It's often assumed that they were made on a shoestring budget with no proper production company. They were made out in the street without the use of studios, and the actors who appeared in them were non-professional. Now, all of those things are true in part. The production companies which had prospered under Mussolini through the 1930s, late 1930s and early 1940s, were not operative immediately after the war. They didn't know what was going on. The Allies had occupied Italy, and the Americans in particular were in charge of the communications apparatus in Rome and were very wary about the film industry as they were about the press. These were seen as propaganda instruments of fascism. So they much preferred the Italians to be going to see American films. And in particular, there was a package of 15 films put together by the psychological warfare branch, which were meant to bring Italians over to the side of democracy, to understand why the Allies were fighting and what their values were. So really, those who were operative in the production sector in Italian film after the war were either they were watching and waiting, or in some cases they were really just deciding what else they could do because they couldn't really see a future for film production in Italy. Or in one or two cases, they saw in neorealism, in this new way of making films, an opportunity. And Dino De Laurentiis was one of those.
Early in his career, he was employed by Lux Films as an executive producer. How did that go?
Well, Lux Film was a company that had a branch in France and a branch in Italy. It was a company founded by a powerful industrialist called Riccardo Gualino, who was based in Turin. And it was mostly a company that was involved in distribution. So they distributed American films, French films, and so on. They didn't actually make films until 1940. Now, to understand why the company shifted in that way, we need to know that the American companies, who really dominated the Italian market in the 1930s, withdrew. They decided to boycott Italy in 1939 because Mussolini's government wanted to impose a state monopoly over the purchase of foreign films. In other words, to fix the price. So it was not a competitive market, it was a fixed market. And the American major studios said, we don't like that. We're going to withdraw from the market. And, you see how the public likes that. But instead of the public clamoring for the American films to come back, what happened was that the Italian film industry, which was quite well supported by the state, suddenly expanded to fill the gap in the market and managed to fill it quite well. Now, it was able to do that because Mussolini lent on some of the companies that were engaged in distribution and said, look, to fulfill your patriotic duty, you need to step up and engage in production as well. And that's how a Lux Film, as well as Scalera, one or two other companies, got involved in production. Now, Gualino is a very clever businessman. He realized that film production was a risky business and it required hugely expensive infrastructures. So he thought, well, I want to make films that might make a profit with the minimum risk. So he didn't invest in constructing studios of his own. What he did was hire studios as and when they were acquired. And similarly, actors were hired on a piecemeal basis, none of your long contracts, Hollywood style. And the films, what's more, were produced by a small group, about half a dozen executive producers who worked for the company. So they took on not the entirety of the risk, but they had to justify their position within the company by identifying projects, by seeing them through to conclusion on an agreed budget, and meeting, pretty strict sort of market criteria. So very little in the way of experimentalism, stars where possible, guaranteed formulas. So Gualino employed Carlo Ponti, who had been a lawyer in Milan, and Dino De Laurentiis, who had begun his career as an actor, and set them to work. These were young men with ideas, with enthusiasm and energy, and he set them to work in terms of identifying projects. By this time, Lux, I should say, had moved from Turin down to Rome, where the film industry was mainly based.
So this is where Dino and Carlo met.
That's right. And of course, they're chalk and cheese, which perhaps, when we think of them working together quite closely through the 1940s and into the 1950s, Carlo Ponti was a lawyer from Milan. The Milanese are known for their cold, calculating, business-like approach. And here you have Dino, also from a business background, if you like. His father, we've said, was involved in the manufacture and distribution of pasta, but, from Naples. And the Neapolitans are known not as cold and calculating, but warm and exuberant and creative. And both these men, it should be said, did nothing to contradict the stereotypes of the places from which they hailed. So they really sort of did look a little bit like chalk and cheese, but nonetheless, they found sort of ways to work and cooperate. And Dino in particular, I think, saw in the neorealist films not a contradiction of everything commercial, but the possibility of reinventing a commercial cinema in a new way that was suited to the particular times. That's to say, Italy that was trying to find a new way forward, a new image for itself in the aftermath of war and dictatorship.
So during this period, what kind of films did the Italians want to see being produced by Dino and Carlo?
Well, we tend to, often when we look at foreign countries, we tend to assume that they must be mainly watching films produced by their own national industries. You'll find histories of Italian cinema which only talk about Italian directors and Italian films. The film market doesn't work like that, of course. You've always got a significant foreign presence. And one thing that the Hollywood studios were very concerned to do in the immediate aftermath of war was to reconquer that dominant position that they'd held in the market in Italy in the 1930s. So they had people embedded within the psychological warfare branch, within the Allied Control Commission, whose job it was to lay the basis for the studios to return and occupy that commercial place. So Italian film producers were struggling to find a place in the market. And they did that in part by trying to imitate some Hollywood formulas, but also by trying to differentiate themselves. And the biggest differentiation, of course, was in these low budget, non-studio, quite sort of rough and problematic films that belong to the neorealist current. Now, Dino produced his first films before the end of the war. We're talking sort of 1942, 43, but really he came into his own in the sort of the first sort of real post-war season, that's to say 1945, 46. And the first film of any significance that he produced was called The Bandit. And it was a film about a returning soldier who struggles to adapt to civilian life. He comes home, he finds that his house is destroyed, his sister's turned to prostitution, some of his relatives have been killed, and he finds himself also sucked into the underworld and forced into a life of crime in order to try and extract his sister from this sort of world of degradation and so on. And as with all neorealist films, it finishes up badly. There are no happy ends in neorealism. Now, Dino thought, he saw the storyline. The film was directed by Alberto Latuada, a director who made a couple of films before and will go on to make many others. And he knew that Latuada had in mind a protagonist, an actor to play the returning soldier, an actor not very well known called Andrea Checchi, who had a rather, how can I put it, a sort of face that carried the troubles of the world in it. A sad-faced actor who looked downtrodden, browbeaten. And Dino said to him, look, I like this film, but Checchi is no good. We need to have in the leading role Amedeo Nazzari. Now, Amedeo Nazzari had been the number one Italian film actor through the later fascist period. He was seen as the Italian Clark Gable or the Italian Errol Flynn. He was the protagonist of costume dramas, propaganda war films, and light comedies. And in this post-war context, there were lots of people who say, no, Nazzari, no, he's too closely associated with fascism. But Dino said to Alberto Latuada, come out into the street with me and we'll take a photograph of Andrea Checchi and a photograph of Amedeo Nazzari, and we'll see who the people on the street recognize. And they went out with the photographs and nobody recognized Andrea Checchi. Great actor, it should be said, but not a household name. Whereas everybody recognized Amedeo Nazzari. So Amedeo Nazzari got the part, and the leading female role, who's a sort of not quite a gangster's mole because she's also in charge of this criminal gang, was played by Anna Magnani, who had made her name as the unfortunate Pina, who is sort of gunned down in Rome Open City, who became the sort of face of neorealism. So we have this odd pairing of the new face of the post-war years, Anna Magnani, and the old face of the fascist period, Amedeo Nazzari, playing together, but two big star figures in a film that is full of post-war problems. It's largely shot out in the street. It has a certain sort of melodramatic current to it. And I suppose in that way, we can see what Dino was trying to do. He was trying to preserve the best of the new whilst blending it in some way with quite conventional commercial appeals, well-known faces, a melodramatic plot, some violence, some elements of romance, and so on. And this was his first big hit as well. So it went down very well with the public.
Well, only 2 years later, he had an even bigger hit with Bitter Rice. Did he keep those themes going in through Bitter Rice?
Well, Bitter Rice, I think the fact that, if you look, there are a couple of films between these two. But we're talking about The Bandit is 1946. Bitter Rice was released in 1949. So the level, we can see from this that not very many films are being made at this time. The Italian film industry would then take off in subsequent years. But each project had to be conceived very carefully because a flop would be incredibly damaging. You're not talking about companies which are producing 20, 30 films a year, so if one or two go badly, it doesn't matter. In this case, and also because of the way Lux was operating, each film mattered. So again, with Bitter Rice, which was a film born out of neorealism, absolutely. The director, Giuseppe De Santis, had made one film previously and had been involved in all the debates about what post-war Italian cinema should be. He proposed this film set in the rice fields of northern Italy, and was mostly meant to be an exploration of the life of the women who did this seasonal work. And he had constructed around this almost documentary background a melodramatic plot of conflict between unionized and non-unionized workers, between women who were regular members of the working class and women who had been led astray by the illusions of wealth or American culture and so on. And Dino said, okay, look, I'm not interested in the politics here, because De Santis was a communist. And there was some fear when people heard he was going to be making a film like this that it would be communist propaganda. Dino said, I'm not interested in the politics, but I can see that here we have the elements of something really appealing. And clearly what he saw was this same combination, the documentary neorealist element, but also the possibility of injecting well-known faces. And in particular, one of the rice weeders is this young, quite naive girl who loves American culture. She loves American music, comics, magazines, chewing gum, and she's very quickly led astray. And the director saw this as a warning. This was meant to be a warning to the Italian youth. You know, if you consume too much American culture, you'll, go off the rails. Now, Dino thought, look, it's absolutely crucial we get the casting right for this central figure of Silvana. That was the protagonist's name. And so he intervened, very heavily. De Santis would recount later how he himself had chosen the protagonist. But in actual fact, Dino was involved at every stage in making sure that this was a role that was cast well. And they did choose a newcomer for the role, one who went on to become a big star, Silvana Mangano, who Dino also married, of course, in 1949, and became his first wife and the mother of his 4 children.
These are very serious films. Did Dino ever do any Italian comedies during this period?
Well, he did. Because the thing is, the problem with the neorealist films is that they were a bit grim. They're films that are actually quite difficult to watch in some ways, because they are shot through with social problems, with conflict. They very rarely end well. There's always a depressing ending or an open ending. So some Italians rejected them. They got lots of acclaim abroad, won lots of awards, lots of prizes. Bicycle Thieves won the first Oscar, was actually called the Honorary Award for Best Foreign Film. Lots of prizes from critics and from film festivals abroad. But the Italians weren't so keen. They didn't particularly want to go to the cinema to be reminded of problems that they were living through every day. Only the most politicized Italians, I would say, actually watched these films and understood fully their purposes. Most people still went to the cinema with the aim of escaping from everyday reality, and that was the core appeal of most American films that were being distributed in the peninsula. But very quickly, film producers found, well, there was also a strong taste for domestic comedies, for films centered around comedians who were very popular in the theatre, who often had a strong regional identity, whether they're from Naples or Turin or Sicily. And Dino, together with Carlo Ponti, they made a number of films which featured a comic actor called Totò, who had made a couple of films in the pre-war years, and then had stopped, gone back to the theatre, and who returned in the post-war years to cinema, who then became one of the chief box office stars of the late 1940s and 1950s. And his films were made very cheaply. There's often not much of a story to them. but they're always focused on Totò and his physical and verbal comedy. And these films made loads of money, cheap to make, improvised to a certain extent, stealing sketches and gags from theatre shows, put together very quickly, shot in a matter of, often days. But the public was incredibly enthusiastic about them, and especially the public of the South and the provinces. And so these sorts of films made a lot of money for Dino and for Carlo Ponti, and enabled them to take the time to think out what larger projects, more prestigious projects they wanted to invest their efforts in.
We have talked before about how Dino's whole being for producing was looking at the story. His projects were always so story driven. Do you think that began during his Italian period?
That's very interesting, because certainly later in his career, Dino was not always a hands-on producer. He wasn't always the executive producer. In the early days, he was. We have lots of stories, for example, on the set of Bitter Ice, how he would, arrive in his American automobile, stay on set, watch things, intervene, wanting to keep a check on things, but also wanting to make an input to the nature of these films. I think that sort of presence is not so marked when it comes to the comedies. I think there he just sort of, was happy to entrust the projects to reliable directors and was absolutely sure of the box office bankability of the star, and that was that. But I think if we look at the projects that required a little bit more reflection, more planning, then we can see an attention to two things. Certainly story is always important for Dino, and I think it should be remembered that he was a voracious reader. He was always looking for stories, for plots. Now, in the post-war years in Italy, there were quite a few literary adaptations, but there were also lots of original stories being written and proposed. And he was always reading these, always thinking through them. But he seems to have had a conviction from very early on that stories needed to be supported by stars, particularly in that context where Italian films were having to compete with American films, that it was all very well having a different feel, but without stars, it became very difficult to compete at the box office, that you needed known names to draw people in to films that didn't promise sort of music or romance or escapism.
Well, that was my next question. Were the Italian producers actually trying to compete with American producers?
Well, this is a difficult one, because you had different attitudes. It's often said that Italian cinema in the post-war years was dominated by the political left. And certainly neorealism as a current, which was sort of born immediately after the war, it's present certainly till the early and mid-50s, was made by men and women who, not entirely, but mostly were identified in some way with a political project that was associated with the Communist Party and the Socialist Party. That is true. It's not generally true of the producers. The producers were happy to sort of go along with the writers and the directors to support them, but they were not typically men of the left. So when the Christian Democrats won Italy's first post-war elections in 1948, the producers were very quick to try to come to agreements with the government, to get the government to provide support for the industry on the agreement that the industry would not be over political. So there's an engagement on the part of producers in terms of trying to sort of not overly encourage the political aspects of post-war cinema, but to sort of push that bit down and bring the entertainment elements to the fore. Now, in this context, of course, Italian cinema was competing with the Americans, but it was also very much aware that it needed to learn from the Americans. In all sorts of Americans were able to films that had a guaranteed worldwide appeal. And particularly when the Italian producers started looking at export markets, they thought, well, we too, we can't just make films, like the Totò films, basically, which fundamentally appeal to a local market and not much beyond that. We need to make films that actually have an international. After all, Italy is not that big a market. And if we want to make films that go reach outwards and so on, we have to address that market. And that way we can make bigger and more ambitious films.
So, final question. When Dino finally left Italy to make films in America, was there animosity towards him from the the Italian filmmakers?
Well, I think, look, it should be said, first of all, Dino started making American films long before he left Italy. His commitment to making international films dates really from Ulysses, which is an adaptation, of the great classical story, which featured Kirk Douglas and Silvano Mangano. And it was the first time an American actor had been employed directly in an Italian production. And the idea was, do you have this pair, and therefore you can, have the film released in a number of languages, and you can reach the English language market. So when Dino finally left Italy in very specific circumstances to make films, it was because he felt he could no longer make international films in Italy because the government had imposed the condition that films had to be shot in the Italian language. So when he left Italy, there certainly was some resentment because with the prominent position occupied by the left in the Italian film community, that was coloured with a certain anti-Americanism. But I think also there was a certain resentment in the United States towards Dino as, this foreigner who was trying to sort of stick his nose into the American film industry. And I think he had to earn the respect, which he did. I mean, he earned the respect of the American film industry, but that wasn't sort of granted to him when he first arrived. I mean, he had to sort of, win respect with films, like Serpico and others which were well received. So Dino, I think, is occupied from very early on. We know his own film culture was largely American. The films he watched and enjoyed were largely American, and he sort of tries to sort of Americanize the Italian film industry, which he succeeds, in a sort of patchy way, we can say, in doing. But he really sort of perhaps comes into his own when he leaves the country and can make the films he wants with a greater degree of freedom.
And all the better for us in the film industry. So thank you, Stephen, and we'll talk again soon.
I look forward to it, Jana. Thank you.